Hi, this is Mrs. Wiederholt. In this lesson, we will look at how to use interval notation to express domain and range of a linear graph. Now let's get started. Interval notation is another way to express inequalities. There are basically four types of inequalities. 1. X is greater than a number. 2. X is less than a number. 3. X is greater than one number and less than another number. And 4. X is less than one number or X is greater than another number. Now remember, with these four types of inequalities, we can replace the greater than or less than sign with greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. Now let's take a look at the symbols used to express inequalities with interval notation. Interval notation uses parentheses to represent the greater than or less than symbols. And interval notation uses brackets to express greater than or equal or less than or equal. Now let's look at some examples of how we use inequalities to represent domain and range. In our first example, let's look at a line that does not have endpoints, that extends infinitely in both directions. This line really extends in four directions. If you look at this part right here, of this part of the line, you see that it continues infinitely in a downward and leftward direction. And if you look at this part of the line, it extends upward and rightward. Using inequality notation, you would say that the domain of this line is all real numbers. Now you could use that symbol or you could write out all real numbers. You would also say that the range is all real numbers. And the reason for this is because it is going infinitely in the leftward and downward direction and infinitely in the upward and rightward direction. When using interval notation, we would be using an infinity symbol. And so your domain and range would look something like this. We would start out with an open parentheses and say from negative infinity to positive infinity and close it with a parentheses. The range would actually look just the same. Open parentheses from negative infinity to positive infinity. Now what we're saying is if we look at the domain, can we ever equal negative infinity? And the answer is no. So since we can never equal negative infinity, we start off using the parentheses because we are saying that x is greater than negative infinity. And the same is true for positive infinity. Since we never can actually equal infinity, we use the close with the parentheses to represent that x is less than infinity. And the same with the range. We see that it goes from negative infinity to positive infinity. Now remember, domain starts on the left side of your graph and works to the right side of your graph. Range starts at the bottom of your graph and works up to the top of your graph. One thing I do that helps me remember this is I pretend that the x is in the middle. And so I can say x is greater than negative infinity and x is less than infinity. And for the y's, I pretend like I have a y here. And I can say that y is greater than negative infinity but less than positive infinity. Now let's move on to some linear graphs that have endpoints. In this example, we're going to look at a line segment that has a negative slope. On the upper left side, we have an endpoint that is filled in, and on the lower right side, we have an endpoint that is hollow. First, let's look and determine the domain of this line segment. In order to do this, I want to find the x-coordinate that is of this point. Now, if I look at this point, the x and y coordinate is -5 and the y coordinate is 7. So when I'm looking at domain, I'm actually looking at the x-coordinate. If it helps you, you can write it out like I just did, or you can just take your pencil and trace that point down to its x-coordinate. Now let's look for the ordered pair of our second endpoint. And if I look at it right here, I see that the x value, if I trace it up, is positive 5, and the y value can be traced over to negative 4. So if I wrote that ordered pair, it would be positive 5, negative 4. Now let's write our inequality to show the domain for this line. And so we're going to start out the domain, and first I'm going to use inequality notation. And we know that x is greater than or equal to negative 5, but less than 5, less than positive 5. Okay? And for the range, we can see that y is greater than negative 4, sorry about that, I had to look over here, but less than or equal to positive 7. And so that's how you would write that in inequality notation. You put the y in the middle, and then you kind of work to the left. You say y is greater than or equal to negative 4, and y is less than or equal to 7. Now remember that domain is the width of this line segment, from the left to the right, just like that. And the range is from the bottom to the top. It's the height. Now let's look at writing the domain and range in interval notation. For the domain, we will use the x-coordinate from the first point and the x-coordinate from the second point. And it will look like this. From negative 5 to positive 5. So now we just have to look to see, do we want to open with a bracket or open with a parentheses? And if you look at this dot, the first dot, it's filled in, so that means we will need to start off with a bracket around our first endpoint. Now we will look at the second endpoint, and because it's hollow, we know that we will close this off or end this off with a parentheses. Now remember, I like to pretend that there's an x in the middle, and I am saying that x is greater than or equal to negative 5, but less than positive 5. And if you look up above, you've got the same beginning point and the same ending point in inequality notation and in interval notation. For the range, we will need to look at the bottom or at the second endpoint because it is at the bottom of our graph, and then we will look at the beginning endpoint, which is at the top of our graph. And we can also look at those y coordinates. And we want to look at the lowest one first, which is negative 4, and then the highest one, which is positive 7. And so we would write it like this, from negative 4 to positive 7. And so now we just have to ask ourselves, do we need to start off with a parentheses or a bracket? Well, because the point is hollow, that means we're saying that the y values can only be greater than negative 4, not greater than or equal. So because it's greater than negative 4, we will open with a parentheses. And because it can go up to or include 7, we will put a bracket around 7. I do have one word of caution. When writing in interval notation, especially if you're using parentheses to open and to close the interval, it can look an awful lot like an ordered pair. Okay, so please don't get the two confused. Let's do one final example. Here we have two lines with a big space in the middle. So let's get right to it. First, we're going to state the domain using inequality notation. X is less than negative 5 or x is greater than or equal to 2. The first inequality, x is less than -5, represents this line right here. X, if we're going in a leftward direction, would be less than, but not equal to, less than the -5. And the second inequality represents this portion right here. We're saying how far to the right will x go? Well, it can go infinitely. X is greater than or equal. And I know the or equal because the dot is filled in. For the range, I'll be looking at the y-coordinates of the two endpoints. So my first inequality is y is less than or equal to -2, or y is greater than 3. For interval notation, we're going to be looking at the first line right here. Now, I already said that x will go infinitely in the negative direction. So in interval notation, that's what we start with. So our domain goes from -infinity to -5. Now remember, we always put a parenthesis around an infinity symbol because we can never equal infinity. Now because of the hollow dot on that first point, that means we will also put a parenthesis around the -5. Now we're ready to state the inequality for the next part of the line. And that one, it would be from 2 to positive infinity. Okay, well, because of the solid dot, I know that I need a bracket around the 2 or in front of the 2 and a parenthesis after infinity. Now, instead of writing the word or in between these two, we use something called the union symbol. And basically, it's a U. And so this says that our domain goes from -infinity to -5, or from 2 to positive infinity. Now let's write the range. So now if you look over here, right down here, we know that our range infinitely goes in a downward direction. So that means we will start our interval notation again with -infinity. And for this part of the line, it only goes up to and includes -2. So we know that we need to put a parenthesis in front of -infinity, and because of our filled in dot, because -2 is on the line, we will put a bracket around -2. We'll use our union symbol, and now we're ready to start with the next portion of the line. The line picks up where y is 3. So we'll put a 3, and it goes on infinitely in an upward direction, so we will write a positive infinity symbol. Because this starts out with a hollow dot, we know that we will put a parenthesis in front of the 3 and also a parenthesis after positive infinity. Writing your domain and range in interval notation might seem a bit awkward at first, but once you start practicing it, you'll really like it, I believe, a lot better than inequality notation. I hope this video has helped you, and I look forward to working with you again. Bye-bye.